Arthur Dayne lay on the grass beside the Tower of Joy, the broken dawn light casting long shadows across the blood-soaked ground. His breath was ragged, and he could taste copper on his tongue as his eyes blurred in and out of focus. The fight had been brutal, swift, and bloody, leaving so few alive that the hush around them felt like a shroud over the entire Dornish mountainside. Of the Kingsguard who had stood watch at this forlorn tower, he was now the only one left breathing. The scent of death clung to the air, thick as the dust and blood. Ser Gerald Hightower lay somewhere behind him, sword arm twisted at an impossible angle, while Ser Oswell had died near the tower wall. Arthur had fought valiantly, for he believed with all his heart that he was doing his duty, for Rhaegar, for the vow he had sworn to defend Prince Aegon, or whoever might emerge from the hidden truths behind those high tower walls. Ned Stark stood over him, sword in hand, breathing heavily. Dayne's vision wavered, yet he recognized the solemn lines on Ned's face, the unspoken grief that etched itself there more deeply than any sword cut could do. Arthur tried to speak, but his voice came out in a rasp. All around them, the last echoes of steel striking steel seemed to fade into the wind. Arthur closed his eyes, steeling himself for the final blow, remembering all the times he and Rhaegar had spoken of better days, of a realm at peace, promises that had turned to ash in the fires of war. But then, Ned Stark knelt beside him. No blow came, only a gentleness that Arthur would not have expected from a man who had so much reason to end his life. Arthur struggled to sit up, but a wave of pain lanced through his side. He felt his blood seep into the ground. He could sense the presence of Howland Reed as well, though the Crannogman was neither close friend nor sworn enemy, just a quiet, steadfast companion to the man who knelt there. Arthur realized with a sickening clarity that he might not survive long enough for any final words to matter. Yet Ned Stark pressed his hand to Arthur's wound, as if trying to stanch the bleeding. In that moment, Arthur understood that the man before him had a sense of honor that transcended the brutality and chaos of war. There was no hatred in Ned's eyes, only sorrow and a glimmer of something else. Compassion, perhaps, or regret over all the lost souls this conflict had claimed. When Arthur tried to speak again, his words failed. Instead, he lifted his gaze, searching for the fate of the tower he had defended. Past Ned's shoulder, he could see the broken doors, could almost picture the lifeless bodies within. The truth that had been hidden inside those walls lay with Lyanna Stark, and if fate willed it so, with her child. Arthur had guarded that secret under Rhaegar's orders, believing it would preserve the future of the Targaryen line. But that future was in question now. The realm had shattered into pieces, and duty to a dead prince felt like a chain around Arthur's neck. Ned Stark, resolute, gestured for Howland Reed to help. The small man checked Arthur's wounds with as much tenderness as he could manage, tearing pieces from his own garments to bind Arthur's side. Arthur winced, a strangled sound escaping his lips. He looked upon Ned Stark again, as if demanding an explanation. Why save a sworn enemy? Why preserve the last Kingsguard who had fought against him so fiercely? Ned Stark spoke softly, voice thick with weariness. Sir Arthur Dayne, I have no desire to spill more blood. You have fought for what you believed was right. I do not claim to understand all you have done, but I know you are an honorable man. He paused, eyes flickering to the tower. The realm has had enough death. Arthur's eyes watered, not from the pain alone, but from the weight of that statement. The Sword of the Morning had always prided himself on serving the realm's rightful king. But if Rhaegar was gone, if young Aegon was gone, if all the Targaryen heirs were butchered, what remained of his vows? The taste of failure filled him, yet he clung to life with surprising tenacity. He and Ned Stark both sensed that destiny was not finished with him. Howland Reed helped lift Arthur onto a makeshift pallet of blankets. They worked swiftly but with an awkward urgency, as if uncertain whether every breath might be his last. Arthur felt each step as they carried him into the tower, where Lyanna Stark lay dying. He remembered that his vow of silence had extended to protecting her. Ned, gentle as he was toward Arthur, slipped away into the darkness of that tower room. Arthur could hear the man's anguished cries moments later, and the hush that followed spoke of yet another tragedy. When Ned emerged, something different shone in his eyes, an unbreakable determination, perhaps, as though he had gained a purpose from the heartbreak. Arthur did not pry, nor could he have if he wanted. He drifted in and out of consciousness, images swimming around him. The flash of dawn's pale blade, Rhaegar's silver-haired figure, the hot Dornish sun glaring down on a war-torn world. Days passed in blurred intervals. Arthur was barely aware of the journey north. He understood that Ned Stark, in an act of mercy, had decided not to reveal Arthur's survival to anyone else. Arthur's presence would raise questions, dangerous ones that might put Ned and the secrets of the tower at risk. He was placed in a covered wagon, hidden from prying eyes, while Ned's men traveled with them, forming a small, unremarkable caravan. Arthur sometimes dreamed that he was riding with Rhaegar again, discussing how best to serve the realm, only to awaken to find himself bandaged and in pain, with nothing but the quiet hush of northern men speaking in low voices around the campfire. As the caravan crossed from the Dornish marches into the Reach and continued on toward the Riverlands, Arthur slowly recovered some of his strength. He yearned to see the sun again, to feel the wind on his face, but he remained hidden. He listened to the talk of Ned's men, of how Robert Baratheon was now king, how Tywin Lannister had sacked King's Landing, how the Targaryen children were rumored to be dead or vanished. Each revelation struck Arthur like a hammer. Everything he had known, everything he had sworn to defend, had turned to dust. At times, he wondered why Ned Stark had bothered to spare him at all. Yet there was a small voice inside him that whispered, because not all men are the same, because some men value honor above vengeance. They reached Winterfell under the cover of night. The seat of House Stark rose starkly from the vast northern expanse. Its towering walls and stone keep exuding a quiet strength. Arthur had never been this far north before. Even in the blackness, he could sense the magnitude of the place, the chill in the air, the faint tang of pine on the wind. Ned saw to it that Arthur was carried into a secluded room far from curious eyes. Even the maester who tended Arthur did so under Ned's strictest orders to keep Arthur's identity a secret. The older man did not press too many questions. He seemed to trust Ned's sense of honor, or at least recognized that some secrets were too dangerous to speak aloud. Weeks bled into months. Arthur began walking again, albeit slowly. He spent hours at night sitting by a small fire in his private room, turning over dawn in his hands. The white blade gleamed faintly, a memory of who he had once been. The sword of the morning, a legendary knight, beloved by the realm. Now he felt like a shadow of himself. The conflict between his old vows and this new life gnawed at him. Should he remain loyal to a dead house that no longer held the throne? Or should he, as the seven gods might intend, use his skill to serve the living, perhaps even to protect the North, which had sheltered him out of an unlikely mercy? Ned visited him whenever he could, though his duties as Lord of Winterfell were many. He never pressed Arthur for secrets about the tower or about Rhaegar, though Arthur could sense an unspoken tension between them. Arthur had his own questions. What had transpired in that tower after he lost consciousness? Had the child survived? And if so, where was that child now? But both men observed an unspoken rule of silence. Some things were too perilous to discuss. Over time, Ned introduced Arthur carefully to certain members of the Stark household. They did not know his true identity, only that he was a skilled swordsman who had come north after the war. Ned presented him as a distant cousin of House Dayne, or sometimes a friend from the south who needed refuge. Arthur was careful not to contradict any story Ned told. He found himself wearing simpler clothes, garments woven of thick northern wool that kept out the biting cold. Gone were the silks and refined linens of his life in Dorne. Gone too were the elaborate ceremonies of the Kingsguard. It felt strange, but a part of him welcomed the anonymity. He had lost the people he cared for most. Perhaps anonymity was the only path that remained. During these early days in Winterfell, Arthur spent hours in the courtyards watching young men at their practice. Benjen Stark, younger brother to Ned, would occasionally spar with the guards. The younger Stark had an agile, almost playful style, and Arthur found himself quietly analyzing it, noting openings, strengths, and weaknesses. Robb Stark was merely a babe in the arms of servants, though he toddled about chasing after puppies. Jon Snow, a dark-haired infant with somber eyes, was there as well, watched over by servants on the fringes. Sansa and Arya had not yet been born, and Catelyn Stark was a new presence in Ned's life, gracious yet reserved with this mysterious southern guest in their midst. Arthur's first real contact with the Starks, outside of Ned, came when he found himself in the Godswood. He had wandered there seeking solace, drawn by the stillness of the ancient weirwood. It was a place so different from the warm, sun-soaked groves of his homeland. Here, the quiet felt sacred, the heart tree's face watching with an eternal vigilance. As Arthur knelt by the pool, lost in his thoughts, he heard soft footsteps. It was Catelyn Stark, who approached him with a respectful nod. She inquired politely about his health, about whether he needed anything. He recognized in her eyes a keen intelligence, a desire to understand the stranger in their midst. But she was ever the dutiful lady, and pressed him only so far. Arthur sensed that, for all the polite courtesies, she suspected something unusual about him. The secret lingered in the air like unsaid words. As the weeks turned into months, Ned began to ask Arthur for small favors, tasks that would normally fall to a skilled swordsman or a trusted retainer. Arthur found himself accompanying Ned on short rides through the Wolfswood. He helped instruct some of the young guards in swordsmanship. At first, the men were skeptical. Who was this quiet southerner with the haunted eyes and the refined technique? But once they felt the sting of a training sword in their hands or found their own weapons effortlessly parried, they gained a new respect for him. Word began to spread that this Dayne was no ordinary swordsman. He moved with a deadly grace that belied the scars and weakness of a recovering invalid. Through these interactions, Arthur began to forge a new sense of purpose. The harsh northern wind stung his cheeks. The cold stone corridors of Winterfell forced him to adapt to a life without constant sunshine. Yet he found a warmth among the people that reminded him of why he had once dreamed of a better realm, side by side with Rhaegar. Perhaps in the north that dream could take root again in some new form. He could see Ned Stark's quiet leadership, the way the man inspired loyalty not through fear but through honor. It was a stark contrast to the blood-soaked throne in King's Landing, where Robert Baratheon now sat. Torn by conflicting loyalties, Arthur wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. House Targaryen was all but extinct, and the man who wore the crown had spilled much blood to get it. Yet Ned Stark, a man of unimpeachable integrity, had taken in Arthur, risking his own security to save him from death. If anyone could rebuild the fractured kingdom into something resembling justice, it might be men like Ned Stark. Arthur recognized that the best chance for the realm, and for the ideals he had once cherished, might now lie in service to House Stark, or at least in service to the north. It was Ned himself who broached the subject one winter night, as the two shared a quiet meal in Ned's solar. The rushlights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled. They had been discussing inconsequential matters, the next day's routine, the upcoming harvest, when Ned suddenly fixed Arthur with a serious gaze. "Arthur," he said softly, for by now the formalities had somewhat eased. "I wonder if you have decided what your path forward is. The realm is changing. Robert sits the Iron Throne. Tensions may arise again if the crown is ill-managed. I do not wish to see more bloodshed, but I fear the realm may not remain peaceful." Arthur set down his cup, the wine inside untouched. He studied Ned's face, searching for any ulterior motive. But Ned Stark was not one for hidden agendas. His honesty shone through, as always. Arthur sighed, his voice heavy. "Lord Stark, I am torn. My vows to the Kingsguard bound me to defend House Targaryen. But that house is fallen. My oath might be considered void. Rhaegar was like a brother to me, but he is gone. Aerys was mad, and he is gone as well. The children, I've heard rumors, but I do not know. Perhaps a few remain across the sea. Perhaps not." He paused, letting the realization fully sink in. I have no rightful place now, yet I live, thanks to your mercy." Ned took a sip of his own wine. "I will not pretend to know the intricacies of your vows, or the grief you carry, but I do know what it is to lose loved ones to this war." His expression flickered with pain at the memory of Lyanna, Brandon, and his father. "If you wish to seek a new path, my door is open. If you wish to depart, I will not stop you. But know that I could use a man like you, someone who values honor." Arthur felt a stirring inside. Honor had been the bedrock of his life. He had expected a swift death at the Tower of Joy, but life had given him another chance. "If I can serve honor, if I can protect the innocent and fight for justice, then perhaps my sword still has a purpose." "Then stay," Ned said with quiet conviction. "Stay and help me protect my people. Help me raise my children to be better men and women than we have known in these dark times." Arthur inclined his head, a gesture both of humility and acceptance. "So be it, my lord." From that night forward, Arthur Dayne was no longer simply an invalid recovering in secrecy. He became a knight in service to House Stark, though only Ned, Howland Reed, and a handful of others knew the full truth. To the wider household, he was simply Ser Arthur, a skilled warrior from the south who had chosen to pledge himself to Ned out of respect for the man's integrity. Catelyn eyed him with measured curiosity, while Benjen welcomed him as a sparring partner and friend, though the younger Stark would occasionally send searching glances Arthur's way. Arthur's integration into northern life was not without challenges. The climate alone tested his fortitude daily. He found the cold bracing, even punishing at times. Dornish blood did not warm easily under such conditions, but the lessons he had learned during the war, grit, endurance, discipline, served him well. Gradually, the people of Winterfell came to respect this quiet, deadly knight who gave pointers in the courtyard and occasionally rode out to deal with bandits on the fringes of the Stark domain. When Ned traveled south for Robert's coronation and subsequent festivities, Arthur remained in Winterfell, partly to avoid causing unwanted speculation. The realm believed Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, to be dead. For the sake of Ned's secret, for the sake of any child that might have survived the Tower of Joy, Arthur had to keep it that way. But as the months turned into years, and the realm settled into a fragile peace under King Robert, Arthur found himself at a crossroads yet again. Was this quiet existence in the north truly enough for him? Could he watch from a distance, content to be a silent guardian? A turning point came after Ned's return. Robert Baratheon was secure on his throne, or so it seemed. Word reached Winterfell of increasing tensions along the coasts, of Greyjoy ambitions, of restless lords in the south. Ned, who had found little comfort in King's Landing, grew increasingly concerned about the realm's future. He trusted Robert as a friend but had misgivings about the king's ability to rule wisely. Robert was a warrior, not a statesman, and the realm needed more than a strong arm. It needed just governance, stability, a sense of unity. Arthur felt Ned's unease and recognized in it a mirror of his own feelings. Despite everything, the realm was not truly at peace. The seeds of future conflicts lay hidden in the grudges and ambitions of great houses. Arthur began to accompany Ned more often on travels across the north, meeting lesser lords and learning their concerns. He felt an affinity for these rugged, straightforward folk. Their loyalty was earned, not demanded. He watched the respect they showed Ned, not out of fear, but because Ned looked after them in turn. And slowly Arthur realized that this was the kind of rulership the realm desperately needed. The king on the Iron Throne would not ensure fairness and justice for all his subjects. But men like Ned Stark might. If Arthur could serve as a sword for such men who genuinely cared for the well-being of their people, then he might finally reconcile the conflict within his soul. During one of these travels, they stayed at a small holdfast plagued by reports of wildling raiders coming over the wall in small groups. Arthur's presence was a comfort to the villagers. He helped train a small militia, teaching them defensive maneuvers. One evening, a group of outlaws attempted to steal livestock from the holdfast, believing it easy prey. Arthur, Ned, and a few guards confronted them under the pale light of a full moon. The outlaws were no match for Arthur's skill. He disarmed one with a flick of his wrist, sending the man's sword spinning into the snow. Ned subdued another. The rest either fled or surrendered. Later that night, while the villagers thanked them profusely, Arthur realized he hadn't felt this sense of fulfillment since the days he had dreamed with Rhaegar about creating a better world. In quiet moments, Arthur still remembered Elia Martell's gentle grace, Rhaegar's steadfast conviction, and the vow he had made to protect the Targaryen children. Those memories did not fade, but they no longer trapped him in a cycle of guilt and regret. Instead, they became reminders of what had been lost and what he might still protect. Jon Snow, who grew under Winterfell's roof, was a living testament to secrets best left unspoken. Arthur watched the boy from a distance, sometimes offering a kindly word or a brief lesson in swordplay. He saw a fierce determination in Jon's eyes, something that reminded him of Rhaegar's quiet resolve. He wondered if Ned would ever tell the boy the truth of his parentage. He suspected not, for that truth was as dangerous as a wildfire in King's Landing. Years flowed by, bringing new members to the Stark family. Robb grew tall and proud. Sansa was born with the Tully coloring. Arya arrived in a storm of willful energy. Bran with curious eyes. Rickon in the midst of a deep winter. Arthur found himself a silent sentinel in the courtyard, the occasional teacher who helped them refine their stances with wooden swords, though Ser Roderick Castle officially served as their master-at-arms. Arthur's role was unofficial, more akin to an older brother's friend who happened to be one of the greatest swordsmen alive. He offered pointers, not wanting to overshadow Roderick. He had no desire for fame or recognition. He had once worn white cloaks and served as the realm's finest knight. Now he wore woolens and served as an unsung guardian. Yet for all his subdued presence, the older Stark children gravitated toward him. Robb admired the subtlety of Arthur's style, how he never wasted emotion. Jon, who often felt overshadowed by Robb, asked Arthur for extra pointers when no one was watching, and Arthur obliged with a gentle smile and quiet encouragement. Even Theon Greyjoy, a ward brought to Winterfell after the failed Greyjoy rebellion, sparred with Arthur now and then. Despite Theon's brash demeanor, Arthur offered him the same patience he would any pupil. Each child of Winterfell, ward or trueborn, sensed something special about this man from the south, though they could not name it. Perhaps it was the sadness in his eyes, or the warmth that belied his stoic exterior. And so, life at Winterfell continued, day by day, season by season, until the start of a new decade. By then, Robert Baratheon had settled into his kingship, indulging in feasts and hunts. The realm had quieted, though tensions smoldered beneath the surface. Tywin Lannister remained Hand of the King for a time, but the realm whispered of strained relations between King Robert and the Lannisters, especially Queen Cersei. News from the east told of exiled Targaryens, Viserys and his sister Daenerys, wandering the free cities in search of allies. Arthur's ears always pricked at rumors of Targaryen movements, but they were fleeting, ephemeral. He wondered if, one day, the realm would face another war for the Iron Throne. If so, would Ned Stark march in Robert's name? Would he, Arthur Dayne, be forced to make a choice that would reignite his old vows? One crisp morning, after Ned received a raven's message, Arthur noticed Ned's pensive mood. The Lord of Winterfell stood by a window in his solar, gazing out at the falling snow. Arthur entered quietly, sensing something was amiss. Ned offered him the message to read. King Robert was planning a grand journey north, intending to name Ned Stark as the new Hand of the King after Jon Arryn's sudden death. Arthur's heart sank as he read the words. Jon Arryn's death was alarming enough. He had been a stabilizing presence for Robert. Now the king looked to Ned. That meant Robert, his queen, and their retinue would all be descending on Winterfell. Arthur met Ned's gaze. "He's coming here," Arthur said. It was not a question, but a quiet statement laden with implications. If King Robert arrived, along with Lannisters and other court officials, would any of them recognize Arthur Dayne? Most believed him dead, but the older knights who had fought in the rebellion might recall the face of the Sword of the Morning. If discovered, The questions would be endless, possibly dangerous for Ned and for the secret child. A single slip of the tongue could unravel everything. "Yes," Ned replied, raking a hand through his hair. "I will do my duty as Robert's friend and vassal. But for you, it poses a great risk. You would be safer away from Winterfell during the king's visit." Arthur nodded slowly. "Where would I go? Perhaps you could ride to White Harbor or even the Neck to stay with Howland Reed. Anywhere out of Robert's immediate sight." Ned paused, his eyes full of remorse. "I cannot offer you a better solution, my friend. Robert is a good man in many ways, but he hates Targaryens and those who serve them. If he discovered you, I fear what might happen." Arthur pondered his next move. He had grown attached to Winterfell and its people. Departing felt like exile all over again. But Ned's logic was sound. Robert was impulsive, given to rage where Targaryens were concerned. The risk was too high, especially with so many southern lords and ladies attending. The best chance for secrecy was distance. "Then I shall go," Arthur said, voice hushed. "For your sake, for mine, and for the secrets we both keep." Arthur left 2 days before the king's retinue was expected. The departure was subdued, marked by a lingering sense of longing. He said goodbye to Benjen, who had decided to take the black at the wall. They clasped forearms in a gesture of mutual respect, neither speaking of their regrets. He quietly said his farewells to Lady Catelyn, who wished him a safe journey without prying too deeply into the reasons. The children, Robb, Jon, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon, were told only that Ser Arthur had business elsewhere and would return eventually. Jon looked the most downcast, and Arthur ruffled the boy's hair, promising to keep an eye out for interesting stories to share when he returned. Mounted on a sturdy northern Garin, Arthur departed Winterfell with a small pack of supplies and only a single companion, a trusted guard who had proven his discretion. The road south through the Wolfswood was cold, the trees barren of leaves. Arthur's breath formed small clouds in the air as he reflected on how far he had come from the scorching Dornish sands to this bleak, snow-draped forest. Yet a warmth lived within him. He was no longer aimless. He had chosen to serve a just ruler, a man who truly embodied the chivalric values Arthur had upheld since youth. In House Stark, he had found a cause worthy of his sword. He spent a few weeks in the Neck with Howland Reed, who welcomed him in his strange Crannogman way, offering fish stews and frog delicacies. Arthur was reminded of the man's bravery at the Tower of Joy and how their shared secret bound them together. Howland was content to let Arthur stay as long as he wished, though he did not press Arthur for stories or ask too many questions. Their conversations were mostly about the state of the realm, the possibility of White Walkers, which Arthur had once dismissed as old wives' tales, and the Reed children's curiosity about knights and chivalry. The Crannog people were a quiet folk, preferring to keep their distance from the politics of the great houses. Still, they served the Starks faithfully and had no love for the Ironborn or the Lannisters. While Arthur waited for word from Ned that it was safe to return, he thought often of Robert's arrival in Winterfell, of the grand feast that would undoubtedly take place, the hunts, the intrigues. He imagined the boisterous laugh of the king, echoing through the great hall. He pictured the wary glances of the Lannisters. Perhaps Jaime Lannister himself, once Arthur's fellow Kingsguard, now the Kingslayer, would be there. How would Jaime react if he somehow discovered Arthur was still alive? The idea twisted Arthur's gut into knots. Jaime had slain the Mad King, but that act, however it had ended Aerys' tyranny, had also shattered the Kingsguard's sacred code. Arthur felt an uncomfortable mixture of pity and anger toward Jaime. And then there was the Queen, Cersei, whose ambition was whispered about throughout the realm. It was best Arthur remained far away. He exchanged ravens with Ned sporadically, each message carefully worded. When Ned departed Winterfell for King's Landing to serve as hand, he advised Arthur to remain in the Neck a while longer. The situation at the capital was delicate, and Robert had insisted that Ned bring his daughters south. No mention was made of Jon or the younger boys, who remained in Winterfell. Arthur gleaned from Ned's letters that the realm's politics were growing more treacherous. The Lannisters tightened their hold on the king, and tensions were brewing with House Tyrell and House Martell. Stannis Baratheon brooded on Dragonstone, overshadowed by his elder brother's rule. Renly Baratheon, charismatic and popular, sat on the small council. And somewhere across the narrow sea, Viserys Targaryen plotted to reclaim his father's crown. Finally, after many weeks, word came that King Robert's visit to Winterfell had long concluded, and that Ned was now in King's Landing with Sansa and Arya. The danger of immediate recognition had lessened for Arthur, so he bid farewell to the Reeds and made his way back north. On the road, he heard unsettling rumors. Ned Stark had uncovered troubling secrets at court, and there were whispers that the new hand was investigating the death of Jon Arryn. Some travelers spoke of dwarfs and curses, some spoke of the Queen's dark secrets, and others talked of a pack of direwolves that had re-emerged in the north. Arthur did his best to sift through rumor and guesswork, but the overall sense was one of impending calamity. The realm was not at peace. It was on a knife's edge. Upon returning to Winterfell, Arthur found it quieter, gloomier. Catelyn Stark had ridden south as well, taking Tyrion Lannister captive on the road, so the servants whispered. Robb Stark had assumed the role of acting lord, though he was hardly more than a boy. The castle felt emptier in many ways, with only Bran, Rickon, and Jon Snow remaining of the Stark children, aside from Robb. Bran had suffered a terrible accident while climbing the castle walls. He was in a coma for a time, and though he had awoken, his legs remained paralyzed. The poor boy's once boundless energy was replaced by a quiet, haunted look. Jon was moody, chafing at his bastardy and uncertain about his future. Soon he would depart for the Wall to join the Night's Watch, a decision that weighed heavily on him. Arthur saw how the boy's longing for belonging mirrored his own early days of confusion. As the days passed, ravens brought grim tidings. Ned had been arrested for treason. King Robert was dead, supposedly after a hunting accident. Joffrey Baratheon, Robert's supposed son, had ascended the throne, and the North now cried out for the release of Lord Stark. Letters flew from castle to castle, each carrying dreadful news. Arthur read them with growing dread. The realm was on the brink of war. Tywin Lannister and his bannermen marshaled forces near the Trident. Robb Stark, a boy of 15, was forced to call the banners and ride south to rescue his father. Arthur watched it all unfold with a sense of helplessness. He was sworn to protect the North now, to fight for the Starks. Yet he had to remain cautious about revealing his true identity. Even so, Robb Stark needed every capable sword. Arthur could no longer remain idle. If this was to become a war, then the North would need more than a hidden sword. It would need the skill of Ser Arthur Dayne. He resolved to reveal himself, at least partly, to Robb Stark. The truth might stun the young lord, but in times as dire as these, half measures would not suffice. He found Robb in the Great Hall, poring over maps with Maester Luwin, Theon Greyjoy, and the northern lords who had answered the call. They looked up as Arthur entered. Robb acknowledged him curtly. His manner had become more serious in recent days. Arthur approached, bowed his head respectfully, and asked for a private moment. Robb hesitated but nodded, gesturing for the others to clear the hall. Maester Luwin lingered a moment, curious, but eventually joined the rest of the lords outside. Now alone in the great hall, the candlelight playing across the stone walls, Arthur took a deep breath. Robb stood beside the high seat of House Stark, wearing a sword at his hip, his expression set with youthful determination. "What is it, Ser Arthur?" Robb asked, tension evident in his voice. "We have little time to spare." Arthur nodded. "My lord, I come to offer you my fullest service in the war that is upon us. But before I do, you must know the truth of who I am, or at least enough of it to trust me completely." Robb's gaze narrowed. "You are a sworn knight under my father's service. What more is there?" Arthur reached for the hilt of the sword at his side. Slowly he drew it. The blade was unlike the standard steel found in the north. It gleamed pale and milky in the torchlight, a sword forged from the heart of a fallen star. Dawn. Robb's eyes widened. Arthur placed the sword gently on the table, letting the faint glow of the metal speak for itself. "My father told me of this sword," Robb whispered, eyes flicking from the blade to Arthur's face. "It belonged to Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. But he died during Robert's rebellion." Arthur inclined his head, his voice quiet. "He did not. Or at least the realm believes he did. In truth, I survived the Tower of Joy. Your father spared my life. I have remained hidden ever since, serving House Stark in secrecy to protect certain truths." Robb reeled, taking a step back as if the realization staggered him. "Ser Arthur Dayne, you fought for the Targaryens. You were the greatest knight of your time." His voice held a mix of awe and apprehension. Why would my father keep you alive? Keep you hidden? "That is a story only your father can fully explain," Arthur said gently. "But I swear on my honor as a knight that I am loyal to House Stark now. I owe your father my life. More than that, I believe in him. I believe he is a just and honorable man, one who could bring peace to the realm if given the chance." Robb stared at the sword for a long moment. "If what you say is true, then you are a formidable ally indeed." He took a shaky breath. "My father always told us about your skill in battle. He admired you even if you stood on the opposite side during the war. I never dreamed you were here in Winterfell all this time." Arthur bowed his head. "I am yours to command, Robb Stark. If war is upon us, my blade will be at your side." Robb nodded, still struggling to process the revelation. He reached out and touched the hilt of dawn, marveling at its craft. Then he let out a breath and squared his shoulders. "Very well, we march soon. I will need every knight I can trust, especially if we are to face the Lannisters." Arthur retrieved his sword carefully. "I shall ride with you, my lord." And so Arthur Dayne, believed dead by the realm, prepared to march south under the banner of House Stark. The North gathered its forces, lords and their bannermen answering the call of the young wolf. Men from White Harbor, the Dreadfort, Deepwood Motte, Bear Island, and beyond converged at Moat Cailin, forming a formidable host. Arthur kept to the edges of the camp, avoiding the older lords who might remember his face. He aided in training new recruits, taught them discipline and technique. He conferred with Robb, Roose Bolton, and the other commanders about strategy. Robb often sought Arthur's counsel in private, eager to learn from a knight of legendary renown. For all his youth, Robb possessed a keen mind for leadership and a knack for tactics, but Arthur's experience in real war was invaluable. As the northern host made its way south, crossing the Neck and heading toward the Twins, word reached them that Ned Stark had been sentenced to die by the false King Joffrey. Horror and fury swept through the camp. Robb's determination hardened into steel. The young lord vowed to rescue his father, or at least ensure the Lannisters paid a steep price. Arthur felt a surge of anger as well. Ned Stark had saved his life and shielded him from discovery. To harm Ned was to attack everything Arthur now stood for. The night before they reached the Twins, Arthur stood alone on a small rise, gazing at the moonlit sky. Memories of the Tower of Joy resurfaced, the blood, the dying hopes. He remembered Ned Stark's face that day, how close they both had been to death, and how mercy had prevailed. In that moment, Arthur understood that he would do anything to protect Ned's family. If rescuing Ned was still possible, they would attempt it. If not, they would avenge him. The realm was plunging into chaos, but Arthur could at least fight for the cause he believed in. They struck a deal with Walder Frey to cross the Twins, though the price was high. Arthur stood beside Robb when the terms were negotiated. The old man leered at the assembled lords, extracting betrothals and wards from the Starks before allowing them to cross. Arthur's identity remained hidden. Walder Frey cared little for extraneous knights as long as his own demands were met. Arthur, for his part, kept a vigilant eye on the Freys, distrusting their motives. Crossing the Green Fork, the northern army split. Part of it marched with Roose Bolton to confront Tywin Lannister's forces, while Robb led a smaller contingent west, hoping to outmaneuver the Lannisters and capture Jaime. Arthur rode with Robb, advising him on feints and ruses. The young wolf surprised everyone with his cunning, scattering small pockets of Lannister scouts, then luring Jaime's main force into a trap near the Whispering Wood. By the time Jaime realized he had been outmaneuvered, it was too late. Arthur fought at Robb's side during the ambush, wearing unmarked armor to conceal his identity. The thunderous clash of steel echoed through the forest as the Northerners descended upon the Lannister camp at dusk. Arthur's sword, Dawn, gleamed even in the twilight, cutting through armor as if it were parchment. The swirling chaos of battle did not faze him. He moved like a dancer, each strike precise. Squires and knights fell before him, stunned by the lethal grace of a warrior they did not recognize. Robb watched with awe as Arthur carved a path through the melee, his white blade a streak of death in the dim light. Jaime Lannister himself joined the fray, golden hair shining beneath his helm. He cut down several Northerners in swift motions, displaying the skill that had once made him a Kingsguard prodigy. Arthur felt a pang of familiarity at the sight of the Kingslayer. Once, Jaime had been a younger man whom Arthur had tutored in advanced swordplay. Now, they were enemies on the battlefield. Arthur hesitated for a moment, uncertain whether Jaime might recognize his technique. But the night was dark, and Jaime's attention was fixed on Robb Stark, the direwolf pup who had outfoxed him. When the dust settled, Jaime Lannister was taken captive. The survivors of his host fled, scattered into the night. Robb Stark emerged victorious, earning the respect of his bannermen and the whispered moniker, the Young Wolf. In the aftermath, Arthur stood guard while Jaime was brought before Robb. The Kingslayer's head was unhelmed, his face pale with anger and frustration. He glared at the assembled Northerners, his pride clearly wounded. He spared a glance at Arthur, but in the chaos, Jaime did not seem to realize who stood behind that visor. A flicker of confusion crossed Jaime's features at the unusual blade in Arthur's hand. But before he could speak, Robb's men dragged him away to be secured. In the following days, the northern camp buzzed with conflicting emotions. They had captured a Lannister prize, but word came that Ned Stark had been executed in King's Landing. Grief and rage consumed the northern lords. Robb received the news in his command tent, with Arthur at his side. The boy lord's sorrow was heartbreaking. He retreated for a time to grieve alone. Then, standing before his bannermen, Robb was declared king in the north. The cry echoed through the camp, taken up by lord after lord. In a single fateful moment, the north severed its ties to the Iron Throne. They would have their own king once more. Arthur joined the chorus, albeit with a heavy heart. Ned Stark was gone, beheaded by Joffrey Baratheon. Arthur had hoped against hope they might rescue him. Now, the only solace was that Ned died with honor, refusing to betray his principles. The memory of Ned's mercy at the Tower of Joy burned in Arthur's mind, fueling his resolve. He would fight for Ned's heir, for the new king in the north. And if that meant facing the entire might of House Lannister, so be it. As war raged on, Arthur served as one of Robb's most trusted battle commanders, though officially he remained just another knight. He urged Robb to keep his identity hidden, for the revelation that Sir Arthur Dayne fought for House Stark might provoke further hostilities or complicate alliances. Robb agreed, not wishing to lose the tactical advantage that Arthur's anonymity provided. The months turned into a blur of skirmishes, sieges, and marches through the Riverlands. Arthur honed his skills anew, forging a reputation as a mysterious southern knight in the service of the king in the north. Some whispered he might be a bastard of House Dayne, or some wandering hedge knight with extraordinary talent. Though victory after victory stacked up for Robb Stark in the field, darker tides shifted elsewhere. Balon Greyjoy declared himself king of the Iron Islands, launching raids on the northwestern coasts. The southern lords squabbled. The Tyrells remained in Highgarden, uncertain whom to back after Renly Baratheon also claimed the throne. Stannis declared himself the rightful king, accusing Joffrey of being born of incest. The realm fracturing into multiple kings was beyond anything Arthur had witnessed. It was as though the war had awoken old hatreds and ambitions across the Seven Kingdoms. In a chilly dawn near the Twins, as the northern host regrouped, Arthur and Robb stood by a small campfire, discussing their next move. They needed the Frey's support once more, but Walder Frey was angling for a marriage alliance. Robb confided in Arthur, torn between duty and the stirrings of his own heart. Arthur offered what counsel he could, stressing that alliances were crucial, but also cautioning that Walder Frey was not a man to be trifled with lightly. Duty warred with personal desire in Robb's mind, but the final decision rested with the young king. Arthur only hoped that decision would not lead them to ruin. The war raged on. Tywin Lannister marched with a massive host, threatening to encircle Robb's forces. Rumors of shadowy powers at work in the south surfaced. Stories of shadows killing Renly Baratheon, of red priests and flaming swords. Arthur, though not a superstitious man, felt uneasy. He recalled old stories of dark magic in the world's corners. The realm was no longer a stable place, if it ever had been. It was a powder keg of rival factions and hidden sorceries. Amid the chaos, Arthur maintained his resolve. He fought for Robb Stark and by extension for the memory of Ned Stark. He also fought for the promise of a more honorable realm, though each passing day made that dream feel more distant. Still, in Robb he saw echoes of Ned's character, that same stubborn sense of justice. The men revered Robb as the young wolf, unstoppable in battle, guided by the old gods. Arthur played his part in securing those victories, using his experience to guide Robb's battlefield maneuvers. But war is ever cruel, and good men often suffer. The cracks in Robb's grand campaign appeared when he broke his betrothal to a Frey girl and married Talisa, a Volantene noblewoman turned field nurse. Arthur, while he admired the love between them, feared the consequences. He knew Walder Frey's temper would not be soothed by apologies or half-measures. The tension only grew as the Northern Army pushed deeper into the Westerlands, trying to force Tywin to the negotiating table. A sense of foreboding settled over Arthur when word came that Walder Frey had finally agreed to a wedding between Edmure Tully, Catelyn Stark's brother, and one of his many daughters. Robb saw it as a chance to mend the Frey alliance. Arthur saw it as a potential trap. The dreaded invitation to the twins weighed heavily on his mind. He confided his concerns to Robb, who dismissed them with careful optimism. "We have no choice," Robb said. "We need the bridge to cross the river safely and to continue our campaign. The Freys have sworn to us. Walder Frey might be cantankerous, but he is not foolish enough to defy the king in the north." Arthur nodded, though doubt churned within him. He accompanied Robb and the northern host to the twins, where Walder Frey greeted them with a veneer of courtesy. The wedding festivities began. Wine flowed, toasts were made, and a false sense of relief spread through the camp. But Arthur's instincts as a knight, honed in the treacherous courts of King's Landing, would not let him rest easy. He stayed vigilant, noticing the unusual arrangement of tables, the watchful, predatory looks among some Frey men-at-arms. Felt like the hush before a storm. When the slaughter began, it was swift and merciless. The Freys and their Bolton allies turned on the Starks. Crossbow bolts rained down, and the music turned to the Rains of Castamere, a cruel Lannister anthem. Arthur had only seconds to react. He tried to shield Robb, but was separated by a surge of Frey soldiers. In the midst of chaos, Arthur's sword flashed. He cut down several Freys, but more poured into the hall. Screams echoed off the stone walls, and blood slicked the floor. The betrayal was total. Arthur fought like a man possessed, each stroke of dawn taking a life, but the tide was overwhelming. He searched desperately for Robb, glimpsing the young king staggering with crossbow bolts in his side. Catelyn Stark wailed as her son was stabbed through the heart. Arthur's mind reeled with horror. Just as Arthur reached Robb's fallen body, more Freys closed in. Arthur fended them off, forging a ring of steel around him. But there was no saving the king in the north now. Robb's eyes stared lifelessly at the ceiling. Catelyn's scream cut through the air, only to be silenced by a Frey blade. Arthur felt as though he were reliving the horrors of the Tower of Joy, the same sense of helplessness, the same shock as everything he cared about was torn away. He moved through the carnage, searching for survivors. The hall was a charnel house, bodies strewn everywhere. In the distance, he saw Roose Bolton draw a dagger from Robb's chest, a cold smile twisting his lips. "The Lannisters send their regards," Bolton said. his voice carrying across the deathly hush. Arthur realized then that betrayal ran deeper than just the phrase. House Bolton had turned cloak. Fury lit Arthur's veins. He lunged, cutting down a Fry who tried to block his path. Bolton turned, eyes widening as he recognized the blazing fury in Arthur's stance. But crossbowmen lined the balconies, reloading to unleash another volley. Bolton sneered, stepping back. "Kill that one," he barked. "He fights too well." Fry men closed in, pikes leveled. Crossbows clicked. Arthur deflected a few bolts with Dawn, but not all could be avoided. A searing pain tore through his left shoulder. Another bolt grazed his side. He stumbled and the phrase pressed in. Despite the pain, Arthur fought like the sword of the morning he once was, refusing to yield. He would not surrender to these traitors, not while he still drew breath. Blood streamed down his arm. A savage blow from a Fry mace shattered his gauntlet, sending waves of agony up his forearm. Arthur's vision blurred, but he kept fighting, cutting down his attackers in a frenzy of desperate skill. Another crossbow bolt ripped into his thigh, and he fell to one knee. The world spun. He saw a blur of motion, men shouting, a final wave of phrase rushing him with spear points gleaming like dark teeth. He swung Dawn upward, parrying the first spear, but the second and third struck him in the chest, piercing through his armor. A gasp tore from his lips as white-hot agony lanced through his body. His grip on Dawn loosened, everything around him muted, as though the hall had become a distant echo. He slumped forward, blood choking his breath. Through hazy eyes, he glimpsed the bodies of Robb and Catelyn Stark. He had failed them just as he had once failed Rhaegar. He thought of Ned and the mercy that had spared his life years ago, and how that small mercy had grown into a new sense of duty. Now, in this hall of death, that duty lay broken. Darkness crept in. Arthur's last thought was a whisper of regret and defiance. He had tried to serve a just ruler. He had tried to honor the ideals of knighthood in a realm that devoured such ideals. His head struck the cold stone floor, and everything went black. But fate, once again, would not let Arthur Dayne's story end so cleanly. Days later, he awoke to throbbing pain, lying on a straw pallet in a dimly lit room. The air smelled of horse dung and unwashed bodies. A woman, one of the healers who might have survived the massacre or been forced to work for the phrase, tended his wounds with rough efficiency. Arthur's entire body ached, his mind a swirl of feverish recollections. He opened his eyes, tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. The woman hushed him. He realized he was a prisoner, outside the thin wooden walls. He heard Fry men laughing and cursing. He was in their camp, presumably at the Twins. How he had survived that night was a mystery. Perhaps his unconscious body had been mistaken for dead, or maybe some Fry had recognized the value of a captive knight and ordered him spared. His wounds were grievous, but the woman had done enough to keep him alive. Arthur pressed a hand to his bandaged chest, feeling the raw sting beneath. Slowly, over the course of hours and days, he gathered scraps of information. The Red Wedding was over. Robb Stark was dead. The northern host was scattered or captured. Roose Bolton had seized control of the north in the name of the Lannisters. The war still raged, but the Starks were in disarray. Walder Frey's betrayal had changed everything. Arthur cursed his own survival. Dying with Robb would have been preferable to living in chains, forced to witness the triumph of treachery. Yet he lived. Memories of Ned Stark's mercy stirred within him, refusing to let him succumb to despair. If there was still a chance to set things right, even a sliver of hope, he would seize it. Despite the pain, despite the overwhelming odds, Arthur Dayne would not abandon his vows to protect the innocent or fight for justice. He owed it to Ned's memory, to Robb's sacrifice, to the realm itself. And so, in that dim corner of the Twins, as the phrase gloated over their ill-gotten victory, the sword of the morning silently vowed that he would fight on. One day he would make them answer for their betrayal, for the blood they had spilled. If there was any spark of justice left in the Seven Kingdoms, he would find it and fan it into a flame that could burn away the darkness. Though all seemed lost, Arthur Dayne had survived once more. And as long as he drew breath, he would never stop fighting for the cause he believed in. A cause that had begun when he first knelt before Ned Stark in the dawnlight of a shattered tower, vowing to serve a just ruler rather than a mad king. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but Arthur had come too far, endured too much, to ever again let his sword lie idle in the face of tyranny.